A stream. All right, very good. Tonight's lesson, session 5, discounting Jesus. Now, when I wrote this, I didn't have in mind, hey, there's a special deal going on down at the Dollar Tree. Jesus is discounted, okay? Now, I'm talking about discrediting or discounting him, ruling him out as a valid, credible, authentic Messiah, okay? I want to start with this introduction line. If you got your pages, there's 3 pages here. And by the way, and let me mention this right quick. Your table of contents that I gave you at the beginning of this study, when you first got your packet, are going to have wrong page numbers because I had assumed every one of these lessons would have 4 pages. Last week's didn't. Today's doesn't. Will not have. It's 2 pages back and back, but it's 3 pages instead of 4. So your number count is probably going to be wrong. But I will go ahead and wait until we're on session 8, and then when I know it's final, I'll give you a revised table of contents page so you can replace the one that you have if you're keeping these lessons. Who's keeping these lessons? Are you actually 3-hole punching them and binding them or anything? Did you do that with the 1st and 2nd Kings? You know, that's, if it's for your benefit, I'd like for you to use it that way. You can come back to this later. Who knows, maybe one of these days you're going to be asked to lead a small group or a Bible study or even preach maybe, and you'll say, well, hey, I like that lesson right there. That gives me a good starting point. Okay, let me start with the introduction about tonight's lesson. This is, by the way, the Gospel of John, chapters 9 and 10, okay? My introduction is this. Once a decision is made, there are some who will never change their mind. How many of you know people like this? Oh, you're pointing at your spouse? They'll never change their mind no matter how much evidence or logic is presented to point out their error. Would you agree with that statement? There are some, I don't want to generalize too much, but it's a fair statement to say at least some. And I'm not talking just necessarily about religious. This is in the secular world too. There are some, in my opinion, who when they've made their decision, they may actually be convinced with new evidence or logic. They may actually think that, yeah, I think I am wrong with their conclusion, but still refuse to change their mind because they can't stomach admitting that they're wrong. How many of you know people like that? So I'm actually describing 2 kinds of people, aren't I? Some who will just not be objective at all, and some who can't swallow their pride when they do know they're wrong. And that's the fatal mistake, as I'm pointing out in point 3, or the bullet point 3 there under introduction. The inability to think objectively and the inability to swallow pride are both fatal. And I probably should have gone ahead and wrote it here, but it's kind of my conclusion point as well. We have got to keep on guard that we don't fit either one of those 2 descriptions. We must be willing to consider all options, being as objective as we can, and we must be able to admit that we're wrong, and that's a sign of maturity. There's a lot of sayings out there in the business world. There's a lot of quotes I've heard. One of my favorite ones, because you know people that are like this, that think that they know it all. You know some know-it-alls? The quote that I like to use is, if you think you're the smartest person in the whole room, you're in the wrong room. I want you to think about that for a moment. I want you to think about that for a moment. You're in the wrong room. Why? Well, the way I take that quote is, if I think I'm the smartest person here, then I have ruled out all possibility that y'all have got anything to offer me. And the point of my life is not, or should not be, showing off how much more I know than you guys, but it should be to learn from others. Now, I guess I could say, and I don't think this, but if I were to arrive at the conclusion that I'm the smartest one here tonight, then I could come away with, that means I'm not going to get anything out of this. And I think I'd be selling myself short, wouldn't I? And if I feel like this is a place, or if you ever feel like you're in a place, because it's possible, it is possible. You don't have to be arrogant to, or it's not an ego problem to assess that maybe you are the smartest one in any given circumstance in that particular room. But go find the room in which you can learn. Go find the place where you are a recipient to someone else's knowledge. And I love this verse, but I cannot think of where it is. But I think it's a good bet that it's Proverbs. As iron sharpens iron, so man can sharpen man. How many of you have heard that verse before? If you find that, let me know. Maybe Psalms, but I think Proverbs. Maybe Ecclesiastes, I don't know. But see if you can find that for me. Proverbs 27:17. In other words, one of my biggest thrills about being with others that are like-minded, like you guys, is I get to learn. How many of you have stood in front of people to teach? Whether it's church or school or whatever context, okay? How many of you have discovered that principle that reciprocates, that you gain more and benefit more as you teach than probably your students do? In preparation, you have learned more than what you're trying to give your students. There's a dynamic there that's going on. It's a phenomenon, but it's commonly observed. Okay, let's go into our first story. It's about a blind man that's blind from birth. And I think this is an amazing story. I've often have shared this, so I know that it might bore you. I know some people that are blind. I have a very good friend named Alan Bastier, who last time I checked, he's still alive. He is involved in ministry over in the Tulsa area. He's originally from Minnesota. I've talked about the fact that people that are blind or who have other type of handicaps kind of make up for their lack of one sense. They compensate with very enhanced other senses. And he has the ability to memorize like nobody's business. I mean, he has memorized all radio stations all over this country because he travels by bus. And he can tune in and tune out stations. He can tell you where the bus is based on what radio stations just faded out and what were coming in. He knows the area he's in. And he used to walk up to kids when kids would meet him for the very first time. He would ask them to quiz him. Name a city, and they would. And of course, our group that went up so many years ago to Minnesota where I'd first met him, they said, well, Oklahoma City. And he would say, Rock 100.5, The Cat. That's a radio station, these students would have been very familiar with. So he had that memory. Do you what, Karen?
He was here.
He's been here. Tom probably would have had him here. Or I bet Tom knows him. Or Chad. Chad would. Yeah. Yeah, that would be correct. He goes to schools, and I'm hoping he's still alive. I haven't heard otherwise. He goes to schools. He demonstrates how he learned to play guitar. He'll play guitar at the school program and show how he feels the frets. He plays cards, and he's got a little, looks like a stapler, but he can adjust that to put certain dimples into the corner of the card so that they are Braille cards. He can tell this is the ace of spades, this is the three of hearts, and you'd think for a moment, oh, you're not really blind. You really know. No, he's reading them from the touch of his fingers. And it's really cool. It's really cool to see And one of the things I often point out about people that are blind is you have to use other words to describe things. Oh, look how blue the sky is. Well, how would that be translated by someone who's hearing you say that, who's blind, who's never seen color at all? Well, I'm sure that Alan and those that are like him that get old enough have learned to associate certain things with certain colors. Not too long ago, I tried to do a little mind reading act with the 4 different colored wallets, that failed thing that I did the other day. Well, there's some truth to the psychology of color. Color has associations with it. Blue could be a cool, soothing, comforting color, while birthing wards would use the color blue. And so when you feel breeze off the ocean, or if you're near the lake and you can feel that coming off the water surface, it will remind you of what you would connect with blue. Okay, that's how you would connect these concepts in different words to someone who's blind. All right, there's somebody who's been born blind in John chapter 9. The disciples have a question about him, and they ask Jesus this question. Verse 2, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? This would not have been a foreign thought, by the way, to think that if you're blind, it's because of some sin. This was a very common thought. Jesus deals with this kind of thinking in Luke chapter 13 about the tower that falls and kills 18 people, or the ones that were persecuted and Pilate had mixed their blood with their own sacrifices. Those are examples in the New Testament of the thinking or the perception that if something bad happened to you, it's because you're a bad person. But we also find this in the Old Testament. Where? Job. His friends are saying, this is all happening to you because you've obviously, I'm going to paraphrase this in probably a not so respectful way, but I can't think of another way, because you've ticked God off somehow. This is why this is happening. Now, Jesus in Luke 13 dispels that. He says that's a myth. But these disciples here probably haven't heard what he said in Luke 13 yet. That's probably something he says later to the crowd. But they're asking him, who sinned? Was it him or was it his parents? And I think this is, I truly think because it's his disciples that are asking him, they're not trying to trap him. When the Pharisees are asking a question, they have the intention of entrapment. I really think they wanted to know. They're with their teacher. They want to learn more about this. Was it him or his parents? And they're expecting the answer probably that any of us would expect. It's either A, the parents, or B, it's him. Or C, both of them, right? But what he gives them is not what they expect. And again, Jesus often answers questions in the most unexpected way when you ask him. And he says in verse 3, neither this man nor his parents sinned. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. Jesus just took this fundamental basic class into a postgraduate context, or it's like we're not talking about stuff that you earn your associate's degree with now. This is master class. Okay, this is about, okay, here's how your doctorate is achieved. This is how we're going from talking about somebody who's blind to night and day. It's as different as night and day, but that's the point. He's using the blind man's condition to describe a spiritual fact that is in existence right now. And while there's kind of two appropriations to this, one has to do with your use of time. Because he talks about there's daytime now, but nighttime is coming. We need to get the work done that needs to get done during daytime before night comes. So there's a sense of urgency appropriation of this, but there's also the sense of understanding or comprehension that's used in this. That is basically like Jesus saying, I know what's about to happen, and what Jesus knows is about to happen is what? Well, he's going to spit and make mud and put it on the guy's eyes. He's going to say, go wash in the pool of Siloam, and the guy's going to go away seeing, right? But there's something else that's going to happen. Neighbors are going to see it. They're going to bring him to Pharisees. They're going to ask about it. Pharisees are going to say, who did this? He's going to say Jesus. And what's going to happen? The spiritual darkness is going to become very evident in the leaders of the Jews, the Pharisees. And so I think there's another appropriation about this night being a reference to the Pharisees' attitude. And that he, Jesus, is daytime's here right now. And they better get this, because I'm not here forever. I'm here as the light of the world. Look at verse 5 again. While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. Here's something you and I may have I'm admitting this. I may have failed to see this. Now he says in John 8, verse 12, if we go back there, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Okay? Here he says, while I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. If you're reading between the lines and you say, well, what would the opposite be? What would you conclude? When I'm not in the world, I'm not the light of the world. While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. When I'm not in the world, I'm not the light of the world. Now follow me on this. He is the light of the world that came into the world, according to John chapter 1, when he entered this world in a fleshly body. There is talk of light before he ever comes. But John in his gospel says, and he came into the world as the light, but the darkness didn't comprehend it. And that is basically the analysis of all of chapter 9 with this blind man story. What he says in the Sermon on the Mount is that we are the light of the world. I want you to think about that for a moment. And the salt of the earth. We are nothing more than reflecting the light of Christ in our life. Now you will see this in the bulletin article that you haven't read yet, because it's not even been printed yet, but it's Sunday mornings, part 2 on becoming a person on a mission. Do you remember there was a part 1 a couple of weeks ago? This is part 2, and in that article, I'll go ahead and just break this to you. In that article, for example, in the first chapter of the book of Acts, Luke writes to Theophilus saying, I wrote to you of all that Jesus began to teach and do. What he began. That was the Gospel of Luke. Because when he writes to Theophilus, it's a 2-volume set, Luke and Acts. They go together, written to the same guy, Theophilus. Theophilus means lover of God. And he said, when I wrote that first treatise, my King James tongue is coming out, in my former treatise is all about what Jesus began to teach and do. And then he implies Acts is about what he continues to do vicariously through the disciples. When you read the very last verse of Mark chapter 16, in like verses 19 and 20, it says, and he was taken up, but he continued to work through the apostles. Who's working after he's gone? He is, through the apostles. And it was through the signs specifically pointed out there, but we still have Jesus working through us today. Jesus is not in this world right now. We are. But don't you think he's still working? And the light that exists is because he's called us and commissioned us to be the light to extend that perpetually till he comes again. So I kind of got a little bogged down there, but I'm just trying to get you to understand that he is speaking of there's a moment that I'm here, and that's now, but there's a moment that I'm not going to be here, and that's coming up. That's why there's a sense of urgency while we must do the work. As long as it is day, verse 4, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. I also think that there's an overtone here, and you'll read this in commentary sometimes. I'm going way deeper than I intended to, and I'm only in verses 3 and 4. Sorry. There could be the allusion to his death. Question. Was there anything left for Jesus to do after his death? Okay, that's true. And by that I mean, besides resurrecting from the dead, is there any work left to be done to bridge the gap? Right. But in regards to salvation, is there anything left that Jesus has to do? He paid the price. He doesn't have to pay any more. You agree with that? Do you believe then when he said this on the cross, it is finished, that everything was paid in full? And that was it. Nothing else has to happen for the possibility of man now being with God, other than the fact that man has to respond the way God expects. Would you agree with that? Nothing else has to be done. We must do the work while it is still called day, because when night comes, then there's no more work to do. That's kind of the way I'm reading this also. When he says this, night is coming when no one can work. Because it's already going to get done. It's already going to be done. I think that's a little bit of an overtone in that. Okay, I spent way too much time there. Sorry about that. Let's go back to, he gives this reply, and then he spits on the ground, makes mud, puts it on the blind man's eyes, tells him to go wash. The blind man did and was healed. Neighbors see him, and they begin to ask questions. Look at verse 8. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging him, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" They would know who the guy looked like, right? He still looks the same. A blind man's eyes can look perfectly fine. I mean, some people might have a discoloration, maybe that's the reason why a lot of the performers on stages wear dark shades. Ray Charles and Ronnie Millsap, they always had the dark shades on, so you couldn't see their eyes. But yeah, he looks the same. He is the guy. But some claimed that he was, and others said, no, he only looks like him. He's got a doppelganger out there somewhere, right? But he himself insisted, I am the man. Now, here's what's funny about this. Let's say that here's the guy right here. We know him, okay? And, hey, isn't that the guy that used to sit by the gate and beg? And you say, well, no, but he kind of looks like him. And he says, I'm right here. I can hear y'all. It's not that I was ever deaf. I was just blind, right? I mean, it's like right in front of him. And he just kind of butts and says, I got something to say. I am that guy. I was blind, okay? So that's how kind of silly this all looks sometimes. There's a couple of, just the instance, like when you can see this. Psychology will do research on this sometimes. If you ever see psychological experiments, when somebody meets a blind man or a blind woman for the very first time, you know what 9 out of 10 people will do? Speak louder. They're not deaf, they're blind. But for some reason we react like, oh, well, I'm Lanny, and this is my wife Lex, and I can hear you just fine. It's just, I don't know what you look like. Why do we do that? I don't know. It's just 9 out of 10 people will respond in an inappropriate, ill-fashioned way like that. I want to ask Jay. Jay, do you have at the Billings Fairchild, do you have deaf or blind there? Yeah. I just wondered if you'd seen anything like this on your own watch, or if you had, maybe there's correlations you can think, okay, yeah, people overcompensate or they miscompensate for somebody's disability or something. And you probably have witnessed that in various ways. But I just find that's kind of interesting that we as human species, we do that. I don't know why. The healed blind man explains what happened. But when asked, he didn't know where Jesus was. They bring the blind man to the Pharisees to see what they'd have to say. Oh, by the way, it was a Sabbath. It was a Sabbath. Ooh, okay. That's taboo. That's bad, right? We know that's bad as far as the Pharisees are concerned. Here is their assessment. And basically, I just have us reading the next several verses. So let's look at verse 16. Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God. He does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "Well, how can a sinner perform signs?" So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He's a prophet." Sam, go say, just say this. He's a prophet. He's a prophet, okay? They still did not believe that he had been blind. Oh, you weren't really blind. Skeptical, right? And had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son? Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that he can now see?" "Well, we know he's our son. We know he was born blind. I mean, we were there, right? But how he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know." Look what they say next. "Ask him. He's of age. He can speak for himself." And you're here, "I can see," right? His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. They don't want to get tagged on and get excommunicated, right? They had already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That's excommunicated. Verse 23, that's why his parents said, "He's of age. Ask him. Don't let us tell you the obvious." We're taking kind of the fifth here. That's what they were doing, weren't they? A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. Are you getting tired of this, Sam? You're getting drug around. You're the specimen on display right now. And they just bring you in this time and say, "Give glory to God, tell him the truth. We know that this man, this Jesus you claim, he's a sinner. It wasn't his doing. Good for you, but it wasn't anything credited to him." That's what they're trying to say. And he replied, "Well, I don't know whether he's a sinner or not. One thing I do know is I was blind, but now I see." And you go on to write Amazing Grace, okay? Then they asked him, do y'all like Chad's class on the hymnology history? That's a really good story of each of these hymns, and we've done Amazing Grace already. They asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" And Sam says, "You're never going to believe this." Can you imagine this? I have way too much imagination, but this is factual, right? "Well, he spit on the ground. I think he made mud. Next thing I know, there's this warm, gooey stuff he's putting on the eyes. And then I hear him say, go wash in the pool of Siloam." So I found my way over there and I washed, and when I did that, of course, I obviously got that out of my eyes and I could see, right? I almost wonder if up to this point the blind man is considering one of two options. In his head, he's thinking, "Nah, they're never going to believe that one." Is he thinking, "Okay, what else would I tell them?" No, but he tells them the truth, right? He tells them the truth. And then they want to know, well, where is he? Which is stupid because he never saw the guy. You never saw Jesus. You were blind when he did this to you. You're not near him when you go wash and you're able to see again. Where did I leave off at here? Oh, yeah, verse 27. "I've told you already, and you don't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Then they hurled in. Oh yeah. So he's saying, do you want to sign up for his class too? That's what they're saying. Ooh, that salt doesn't feel good in that wound, does it? Then they hurled insults at him, verse 28, and said, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. That's to separate us. That's what that's intended to do. We know that God spoke to Moses. But as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. Which is strange when it's the same group that said, we know no prophet comes out of Galilee. But they can't think straight because they're flustered. A lot of what you see that they say won't make sense, and that's the way blinders are. The man answered, now that is remarkable. Here's where the blind man, actually steps up. He sounds more like Jesus than any of the disciples so far. He's pointing out the fallacy of their own common reason and logic. That the fact that they're not using common reason and logic. That is remarkable, he says. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to who? Sinners. You just call them a sinners, but you haven't discredited his miracle. He opened my eyes, and you're just saying give glory to God because God did it, but you're disassociating it from him. He did it. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Verse 32, nobody's ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. He makes one of the most theologically profound statements of the whole Scripture. I almost put this in line with Gamaliel's statement in Acts 5:38 and 39. If this work is of God, you can't stop it. To this they replied, I think this is all in there, by the way. You were steeped in sin since birth, And they threw him out. And all I can think of are the insults given by the Frenchmen on the top of the castle of Monty Python's In Search of the Holy Grail. As your mother smells of elderberries, and all these other insults that are going on. Anybody else Monty Python fans? Okay, that kind of died. Sorry. I'm a little bit into British comedy you saw it, didn't you, Jeff? Didn't you like that scene? Okay. So I'm not alone. There's two demented people here at least. Jesus heard that they had thrown the healed blind man out. I think this may be excommunication. And Jesus finds him in verse 35. And to Sam, this is just like another guy coming up to him. Do you believe, what's he ask? Do you believe in the Son of Man? Now, he's probably going to pick up on the fact, I know that voice. Because you did hear the voice. But you say, well, who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him. And Jesus says, you've now seen him. That's remarkable. You heard him earlier. Now you're looking at him. Man, is that the bell? Did you hear a bell? Yeah, that can't be the bell. Ignore that. You have seen him. In fact, it's me, the one talking to you. And then the guy says, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. I love this story. I love this story. Here are a bunch of questions, and I need to run through them kind of fast. What do the disciples think when they first see the blind man? What do the disciples think? Okay, why is he in that condition, right? That's what they're concerned about. What was Jesus trying to tell his disciples in response to their question? I think I've already answered that. I've covered the fact that he's talking about urgency of time, and he's also talking about something that's about to raise its ugly head, and that was the spiritual blindness of the Pharisees, which the disciples themselves could also be guilty of if they didn't have their guard up for it, okay? What would you say was the experience the blind man had whenever he encountered Jesus for the very first time? Since we were using Sam as an example here, tell me, what were you thinking when he came up to you? Yeah. And what are you thinking when you hear him spit, and he's, making this noise, and all of a sudden it's on your eyes. Ever had that happen before? Probably not. And then you go wash in the pool of Siloam. What was that experience like for you? Or anybody else want to answer if you've been the blind man? Yeah. You think that maybe a blind person that's never seen possibly also shed some tears? Flushed his face? Maybe. Think about this. I love this. This is a lot of conjecture, okay? Take this with a grain of salt. But in my way of reasoning, the first thing that guy's going to see, where's he at? Where's he at? At the pool of Siloam. Is this a babbling brook? No. Is this still water? Boom. You're going to see yourself first. And you're going to think, oh my. No, not.
My first reaction would be, what is this?
Yeah.
Then later it starts soaking in and I'm actually seeing.
Yeah, you're going to go, oh, that's what they look like. Oh, where'd my hair go? Or you're going to say other things. We don't know the age of this. Well, we know he had parents alive. So yeah. I'm watching for the two bears coming out. You're going to see yourself. You're probably going to look up. You're going to look around. You're going to hear somebody's voice that was your neighbor, and you're going to think to yourself, that's what she looked like. You're going to hear the market guy down there. You're going to see the baker and see how chubby he is, or that teacher of the law's voice that you've always heard. Now you think, okay, now you're exactly what I pictured on that guy. You're going to have all these assessments of a new experience for you. That's an encounter with Jesus. That's what I wanted this class to be about, is what did this mean for this guy he'd never seen before in his life? Next question. What would you say was the experience the neighbors had whenever they encountered the healed blind man? Where's his walking stick? What? He acts like he just took a path he never goes. You're going to take the same path every day. You got the steps memorized. You know how many steps before you run into the wall. You're going to make a right turn, 2 doors to the left to the bathroom, or 3 blocks down to your house. You've got it memorized. You can probably even do this without a walking stick. You may just say, I'm coming through. But for the very first time, you're going to veer, you do different things, and people are going to see this. And that's their experience of Jesus through a product of Jesus. What would you say was the experience the Pharisees had when they encountered the blind man, the healed blind man? Well, it's the neighbors that have brought him before them. Okay, what's going on now? What else has he done, on the Sabbath? Yeah. You telling me you can see how many fingers I have, Well, you got 10, but you're holding up 7. That could be your response, right? Well, you've been putting this on all your life, haven't you? You're just somebody freeloader. You just want to sponge off everybody, right? They're discrediting the blindness now. They try to discredit the healing, but now they'll discredit the blindness. Go ahead, Jeff. Yeah. What would you say was the experience the healed man had when he encountered the Pharisees? He did stand up to him. He's got nothing to lose. So what if you throw me out? I never really was allowed in your in-group anyway, because they would have been considered outcast. How do I know that? The disciples think he is what he is because of sin that he possibly did or his parents did. He wasn't accepted. He's got nothing to lose. Yeah, I'll stand up to you. Are you really that blind? you know? What do you think, what do you say the experience was like when the parents encountered the Pharisees? They passed the buck. What would you say was the experience the healed man had whenever he encountered Jesus the second time? When Jesus said, hey, do you believe in the Son of God? What do you think the experience was of the disciples throughout this whole story? They're never mentioned again at this point. They're the ones that prompted this little thing. Hey, did he sin or his parents? And they witness everything that follows right there. How would you describe their experience? I hope they can maybe connect what they just witnessed to the words Jesus told them about night and day. What can we learn from this experience? Basically, it's at the very last of your lesson, the conclusion. I only have one bullet point, but I want to go ahead and get there. It says we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions and be prepared for others who do. In other words, not to be guilty of that ourselves, to be like Pharisees, legalistic, and thinking that we know it all, and we have arrived, and you got to measure up to us. And also, how do you handle people that are like these Pharisees? Because I hate to admit this, there are some today that are just like these Pharisees. And you got to be able to either know how to ignore them or stand up to them or handle them or not let them tear you down for some great work God has going on in your life. That's the main point of this whole lesson. So I'm still showing like 14 minutes on the clock, but if we were run out of time, if nothing else, that's the lesson right there. I just gave it to you. But let's go on with the time that we've got left. This little section here toward the end of chapter 9, verses 39, and then on into chapter 10, basically is summarized this way. And it's a lot of reading, but I'm going to try to keep it concise. After talking with the healed man, Jesus declares this in chapter 9:39. For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Obviously, the blind is the blind man who can see, and those that see to become blind is a reference to the Pharisees. Okay? Some of the Pharisees who heard it took it personally, asking, what? This is the one thing they get. They don't miss this one with Jesus. They know, what is that we call it? How, never mind. There's a reference to this form of dialogue, but what are we blind to? Is that what you're saying? And Jesus pointed out that even though they claimed they could see, that they didn't have proper perspective. And Jesus goes into an analogy about sheep and shepherding. And this is starting at verse 1 through 18. But I want to just summarize it because, I'm going to summarize it in a little bit later in the discussion question because I do break it down there. This analogy of the shepherd and the sheep divides the Jews. And some of the Jews were saying that Jesus was demon-possessed and raving mad. And others were saying he could not be possessed by demons since he healed the blind. That's a good work, right? Huh? Right. Why would a demon or demon possession, who'd certainly be taking up the agenda of Satan, right? This is Satan's workings. This is Satan's angels. These are Satan's forces of darkness, spiritual dark forces. Would not intend good for anything, for anybody. Causing a person to be blind, causing a blind person to be able to see again, it would not be on Satan's agenda for the day. So it doesn't make sense logically. And this is where Jesus would, in another place, say, you know, how would that happen? A house divided against itself won't stand. That wouldn't be for Satan's advantage to do that, to do good. Because he's hell-bent on doing evil. That's what he does. As a matter of fact, in the shepherding analogy, Jesus says the thief comes to what? Steal, kill, and destroy. Doesn't sound like blind man healing is on that list, does it to you? So that's the point that's being made. And it's logical, it's common sense, but the Pharisees are missing it. Either because A, they're not objective, or B, they can't swallow their pride. What did Jesus mean in chapter 9, verse 41, when he told them they wouldn't be guilty if they had been blind? And because they claimed they could see, they were guilty. What do you think he means by that? It's in relation to the good works that this is a good work he's done. He's healed a blind man. But it's more of his assessment of their position. Yeah. Let's say, for example, that you weren't there and you never met this guy and you've been skeptical about it. It's almost as if Jesus would say, well, that would be plausible. I could understand why you'd think that. But it happened right in front of your eyes and you claim that you see good and clearly. But because you missed the more important thing, and that is a man with a disability got healed, but all you're stuck on is you broke a Sabbath law, then you're blind. And it stems back to one of the things Jesus says in Matthew chapter 23, where you have the 7 woes that are given, where he talks about you blind guides, you brood of vipers. He says you swallow a camel but strain out a gnat. Remember this? And in verse 23, he says, you should have been more focused on the more important matters of the law or weightier matters without neglecting these others. He says, you tithe, mint, cumin, dill. You do all that law stuff legally right. But you don't have any human kindness in you. And he talks about love and mercy and peace and justice. You missed that. And in the former lesson that we had, probably last week's lesson, he said, don't you think if the calf falls down or the ox falls into the ditch, you'd rescue it even if it was on the Sabbath, wouldn't you? And so he is again saying, you're stuck on the wrong thing. How many of you have heard this said in a business conference or whatever? We tend to major in the minors and minor in the majors. Have you ever heard something like that before? We tend to major in the minors. We sweat the small stuff. And one of the best lessons I ever seen, you've heard this story before, where the professor gets up in front of his class, he has a jar and he fills it full of marbles, and he asks the class, is this jar full? And they say yes, but he then takes some sand and he pours sand in it. He says, is it full now? Then they say yeah, and then he pours water in it. Is it full? And no, and then that same principle about it's not as you think it appears to be, it really is more to it. I heard a preacher use this same kind of example. He says, this jar is your life. And he had a little pocket New Testament. This is the Word of God. And he demonstrated that if you put the Word of God in first, all the other things will fit around it. But if you put the other stuff in first, you can't get the Word of God in it. Seek first the kingdom of God, right? And they're only seeking their own things. They're majoring in the minors here. Discussion question 2. This is where we break this down. What I would like for us to do real quick is just pay attention. I'm just going to run through these rapid fire points, talking points. The one who does not enter the sheep pen through the gate is a thief and a robber. That's a fact. The one who enters through the gate is the shepherd. The gatekeeper opens the gate for the shepherd. His sheep listen to his voice. He knows his sheep by name. He leads them out. He goes ahead of them. They follow him because they know his voice. They won't follow a stranger because they don't know their what? Voice. Jesus is the gate for the sheep. Those that came before him were thieves and robbers, and sheep didn't listen to them. When the sheep enter through the gate, they are saved. The sheep can come in and go out and find pasture. The thief's intention is to steal, kill, destroy. The intention of the shepherd is to give full or abundant life. Jesus is the good shepherd and lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. The hired hand won't stick around when the wolves come around and attack. The hired hand abandons the sheep and puts them in harm's way. The reason the hired hand runs away is because he doesn't care for the sheep. Jesus, as the good shepherd, knows his sheep and they know him. He is willing to lay down his life for his sheep. The shepherd has other sheep that are not in the sheep pen. He must bring them in also, but there is to be only one flock and one shepherd. Now, one added note that I heard, and I heard this in the last year, I forget exactly, I think, Gail, did you go to that elders deal over at Manford? I think this is where I heard it. One of the elders that was talking that day talked about the sheepfolds did not, we often think of the stone wall or the cul-de-sac in a canyon, whatever was the way you store the sheep, and there'd be some kind of a, edifice there. And we all kind of thought a gate would be like a wooden gate that you open and close. But do you remember a person there saying the shepherd themselves was the gate? They would lay down in front of the open spot instead of there being a wooden gate. That meant that they were, do you remember that, Terrell? You were there too, weren't you? And that sticks with me because I'm thinking, okay, this really is laying down your life for the sheep. It transcends to, of course, Jesus dying for his people, but this is what a shepherd does for his sheep. He's the first line of defense when the enemy's coming. He's there. He is the gate. He's not at the gate. He is the gate with his own life. And I really thought that imagery was pretty cool, that he's the one that's the gate. So that may make more sense now when you see Jesus saying, I'm the gate. Whom do you think Jesus is referring to? And let me back up to that and just say, because I often thought, I got a little confused. Okay, he says I'm the good shepherd, and over here he says I'm the gate. Well, which is it? Is it he's trying to say, oh, I'm this, but I'm also that? The point of the elder was, no, the shepherd is the gate as well. The shepherd acts as the gate. Whom do you think Jesus is referring to by the hired hand? Could be the disciples that abandon or run away when things get hot, especially near him coming to the cross, and they deny or reject or whatever. I think it's the Pharisees. And that they really are the ones that don't know the shepherd's voice. Or they don't have the connection. I think it's true. The Pharisees did not care for the general public of Jews. They cared about how they looked. I think you're right, Gail. Oh, man. Page 18. Let's do this. 2 minutes. There's another festival going on. It's winter. Festival of Dedication. Jesus finds himself in the temple courts again. He's walking along the colonnade, and there's some Jews gathered, and they question him. Chapter 10, verse 24 says, how long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly. And he says, I did. Right? I did. I'll just go on from there. The Jewish leaders picked up stones to stone him because this conversation that he has with him in verses 25 to 30 talks about the shepherd analogy again, and you're not listening to the voice, and you won't listen because you don't know it. You don't know me. You're not giving me time, right? Jesus pointed out that he had done many good works from the Father and asked them, for which of these works are you wanting to stone me? They said, well, we're not stoning you because you do good works. And they don't say you don't do good works. We're stoning you because of you breaking the Sabbath. That's what we want to stone you for. Jesus tried to reason with them from their very own law. That's verses 34 through 38. He quotes a Psalm 82:6. I wish I could get into this. He said also, don't you know that if I'm doing good works, that it has to be proof that the Father's with me, but they don't get that. And they try to seize him, but he escapes. Why does he keep going back to the hotbed? That's a good question. Why if he knows his critics are there? He's not afraid of them, I can say that. Question 2 is analyze the pieces of evidence Jesus offered. Here are the evidences. Works done in my Father's name testify to who I am. Works are good works. Psalms talks about the reference to God's that will have to do with deity, with the God. And in number 4, don't you already think that when the Messiah comes, he will have such an affinity and a relationship with the Father that he will speak as he and the Father are one? In other words, do you think that if you don't, okay, so you guys don't think I'm the Messiah. But obviously, we all agree, don't we, that there's supposed to be a Messiah, right? There is supposed to be one. Okay, so you don't think I'm the one. Let's set that aside for a moment. What will the one act like when he's here, if he's the true one, if it's somebody else other than me? Don't you think he's going to also say the same things I'm saying? I and the Father are one. Or do you think no Messiah is going to have that kind of attachment with God? That's kind of rhetorical what he's saying, because they have to admit, we do believe Messiah is God. They have to admit that. And if they're not willing to admit that, all he has to do is get his Bible out and roll open the scroll to Isaiah 9:6. That says his name will be Wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace, Mighty God, Eternal Father. It's right there. This is about the one whom Isaiah prophesied in chapter 7:14 will be born of a virgin. This is him. And they're going to have to say, they're going to have to acknowledge, yeah, we know that. But they're still going to say, but you're not him. You're not him. I am out of time. I'm sorry. Use the rest of the sheet to go home and have some more of this in your devotional time, whatever. It's just a little short section there at the end of chapter 10. I've already given you the main conclusion point, but I can't go any further without infringing on your time. So I appreciate you even let me go past a couple minutes here. All right, we'll sign off with that.